everyone, welcome to our fourth topic in this class, which is gender. And as per Cynthia Weber's chapter, we're exploring the variable question. That is the thing that goes without saying for this class that we're trying to see, in fact, whether it should go without saying, is this question of gender as a variable. And by the end of this class, I hope you will understand what that question means. My goal is to try to explain to you a little bit of the history of feminism and some of the debates within feminism, and I'll spend some time, a lot of time actually, probably the first half of the lecture, going into some of the debates there. And then I want to sort of cut into international relations and debates in international relations, and then we'll have the setup for the movie we're going to watch, which is Fatal Attraction. And it's a great film. It's a classic sort of thriller. It's our first sort of movie like that we're looking at in this class. We have a few other thrillers to look at, but this one's really good. And the others are good too, I suppose. But this one has this sort of beautiful setup where we meet a psychopathic female and try to see. I suppose at the end of the day, what we're trying to explore is whether the movie sets her up a little bit too easily, and whether, in fact, we have a fair grounds for judging her actions. Clearly, she is mentally ill, no doubt about that. We're not going to try to take that away from her. But as you'll see in the movie, it's not entirely fair the way the plot is set up. She comes out of it looking pretty bad, and it's not all her fault. Some basic facts. Why would we look at gender at all? Why is gender a theory of international relations? Some men especially tune out when it comes to thinking about the plight of women in the world today, because they say, well, I came to international relations to study war, conflict. What the hell are we doing looking at the plight of these sort of women when that's something more to do with civilian relations? And there's a lot of people who would take that point of view, and that's fair. I think, however, that one of the things you'll see by the end of this class is that taking that approach that we should only really fit the question of how women and women's issues matter for international relations into our tried and tested sort of debates about war, why wars happen, the relevance of anarchy. I think that can be a bit stifling for us. One of the things that's really interesting about gender as an approach is that it's the first approach that we're looking at in this class that's not to do with anarchy, right? Think about it for a second. Realism, liberalism, constructivism, they've all been anarchy theories. This is the first theory that we're looking at that's not to do with anarchy. And in a sense, it's the first theory that we look at that says, well, why are we so focused on debating anarchy anyway? I mean, is that the only interesting question we can ask about international politics? If you take the view that anarchy and matters of war as they pertain to anarchy, or matters of anarchy as they pertain to war, is the main issue here, then you're not going to look too kindly on feminism as a sort of a topic that's worth discussing, and that's fair enough. But I would suggest that feminism at least makes a very plausible argument that the anarchy question tends to foreclose more than it admits. In fact, if you want to talk about international relations as having a kind of a dark side, feminism is there. It's trying to illuminate, if you will, the silent victims of international politics, the people who, not just women, men too, children especially, who have more, if you will, at stake in the question of feminism, because feminism is willing to shine a light where international relations in the mainstream won't go. These anarchy theories are all very well and good, but working away, for example, as Cynthia Enloe, the famous feminist, argues, near military bases are legions of women doing the maintenance, doing the cleaning, serving as prostitutes, subject to all kinds of sort of sexual violence. One need only look at the complexity and stories that have emerged around rape cases in Korea and in Japan, where the U.S. military bases are in Germany during the Cold War, to see that men and women have had very tense relations sometimes throughout military careers, and feminism is willing to sort of ask why. The question, why don't we think of that as part of international relations too? When if it wasn't for international relations, we wouldn't be having these sorts of issues. So anyway, just some basic facts here on the screen that are useful for us to think about. Of the world's 1 billion poorest people, 60% are women and girls. Clearly disproportionate there. On the global level, women are poorer than men. Women work 2/3 of the world's working hours, yet earn only 10% of the income. That's classic point there that just really sort of shatters through any sort of myths we would have previously held. That there's just a huge disproportionality in terms of the income distribution between men and women. Women produce half the world's food, but they only own 1% of its land. That means women are disenfranchised or marginalized from decisions about how land is going to be used. And that's obviously going to have some effects as well, because it's men's priorities that are reflected in the allocation of resources for the production of food on land. Maybe women, if you read Yunus Muhammad, the guy that set up the Grameen Bank, which is very interesting. We talk about this in some of my other classes. He has this attitude that when it comes to agriculture in poorer land, women actually, if they're in charge, they make very different decisions to men. So women's ownership of the land could be a very important factor there. Deaths in war today are 90% civilian, mostly women and children. It's a huge fact there. Really comes clearly through. Women make up 2/3 of the estimated 776 million adults worldwide who cannot read or write. That's pretty staggering. Girls make up 55% of the 75 million children not attending school. That's a huge fact as well. Elsewhere, I think there's a few other basic facts I'd throw in or add into this, that women, when it comes to decision making, we were just on this theme earlier on, women only really occupy about 10% of all the positions of power in the world. That is the top level CEO positions, the top level NGO positions, the top level governmental positions, top level military positions, you name it, right across the board. Add it all up, women are only in 10% of the positions where key decisions are made about the fate of the world. And I think it just says a lot about whose priorities are being represented here. So if we want to ask a question then about anarchy and all this sort of stuff that we've been talking about the three previous modules, and we note that these anarchy theories, realism, liberalism, constructivism, are silent on the question of women's fate, then aren't they, by their omission, effectively a form of propaganda for this world where women only have 10% of the power in terms of making the decisions? I'm provoked by that question, and I think feminists are too. We mentioned Cynthia Enloe a little bit before there, and not to be confused with Cynthia Weber, who is our textbook author, but Cynthia Enloe here, talking about the fact that gender analysis and feminism came late to international relations. The first thing we say really is that, and we've just been saying it, is that the sort of bread and butter of international relations has always been war, military conflict, etc. And what I think the feminists have been willing to put forward to assert is a suggestion or a feeling that this is a discipline, international relations, that historically speaking, in its focus on anarchy and war, has rarely asked, where are the women? At best, and the leading sort of exemplar theorist here that we're looking at in our a supplementary reading this week is Adam Jones's text, and you can find that on Blackboard. And he basically asks that if you want to add women to the story of international relations, you have to do it in a way that shows how women are basically just a variable in explaining the outcomes that traditional international relations looks at. So if gender is a variable, that it helps us to better explain why wars happen, where wars come from, or why peace happens and where peace comes from. If feminine values help us to understand some of those questions a little better, then he's saying, by all means, add it in. But if you want to study women's matters in the round and how to change the world to make it better for women, then you're not doing international relations. You're doing something else. You're an activist, or you're a partisan for women's rights, in which case you're not really doing the discipline. So again, it's this sort of clash that we've been talking about even way back in the first class between a scientific aspiration in international relations and an aspiration to decode the sort of purported science of international politics and see what it's covering up. You know, what is the claim that international politics is scientific actually hide? And I think this tension has run the length of the class so far through all the different modules that we've looked at, but I think it's especially germane here in feminism, where for the first time we're even stepping outside of the question of anarchy, outside of the traditional question of international relations itself, and asking, well, where are the women? For Jones, then, just to sort of boil it down to a phrase perhaps for us, in case we wonder what the hell's going on here and we're scratching our heads. For Jones, I think what it sort of boils down to is Jones thinks that international relations is like making a soup in the kitchen. You know, studying international relations is like preparing a meal. And he's suggesting that if you want to taste your meal, you can add gender and stir it in to the pot. Whereas feminists are saying no, the pot itself is biased. Perhaps maybe we could even say it is poisonous for women. And that's the question, really. Is international relations itself a form of violence against women? Some of the facts that we've looked at in the previous page would suggest that it is. For Jones, that would be kind of nonsense. Maybe gender has a variable, it can be used as a variable in explaining war. Maybe it can't. And I think that's the key question. So a little bit of background on feminism and where it comes from. I've talked about this a little bit if you've taken my Politics 1500 class. No problem if you haven't taken that class. I just quickly go over some of this stuff. Much of the current momentum for feminism comes from what we call second wave feminist activism. And, well, what was the second wave of feminism? The second wave of feminism can be distinguished or contrasted with the first wave of feminism because the first wave of feminism famously was the wave of feminism that was fighting for voting rights. And, well, eventually women got the right to vote. But then what happened was they realized that there were structures of power in society that kept the women down, right? For example, sometimes we talk about this phenomenon, the glass ceiling, where in women who get jobs that are equivalent jobs to men find they can only be promoted so far and find that they can only be paid so much. And that is a terrible, terrible shame from the feminist perspective. More so, they talk about this concept of the feminine mystique, which is a social norm stating that it is unfeminine for women to gain education, careers, etc. And of course, Betty Friedan, the woman in the photograph, she was writing in the 50s and the 60s, and what she was arguing really here was about this concept of patriarchy. Friedan believed that all women were basically victimized by what you'd call the in-group of men, right? Women were an out-group, men were an in-group. The in-group gets to make decisions, and the in-group has the power, right? So what do we call this in-group? We call it patriarchy. Most men aren't aware that they're in it, right? And indeed, a lot of women aren't aware that of the existence of patriarchy. But patriarchy is a system that creates standards, social standards. Oftentimes they're sort of silent, or they're more, if they're standards, they operate as expectations more than anything else. The standards of what counts as female virtue, or the real woman. And it's based on the normative expectations of masculinity, right? So it's what men expect from women, right? Men expect women to, because men have the power, men's expectations for women become the norm for society, and women come to think of these norms as appropriate for them as well. And so what the Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was sort of designed to do was call attention to this and ask women to think about it and reflect about whether or not they wanted to be housewives and that kind of thing, to kind of ask, well, why wouldn't you want to become a doctor or a lawyer? Why wouldn't you want to reach higher for yourself and have genuine aspirations? Why do you want to just become a housewife and raise children? Surely you're capable of more. And so for Betty Friedan then, this idea of full self-determination or achieving dignity is very important. And what Friedan sort of called for was a campaign on the part of women to give women better rights in the workplace, to give them the right to education and a career more, to further, at least to open up the playing field for those things, and to fight this feminine mystique, to overcome this patriarchal norm system that keeps women down. And how are you going to do that? You're going to do that through affirmative action, through, for example, governmental plans to provide for daycare for women who have children, so that they don't have to stay at home. Contraception, otherwise known as reproductive freedom, so women don't find themselves pregnant and unable to do anything about it when they don't want to have a baby. Accidents do happen, etc. Better divorce law to give women more autonomy from men should they need it. And consciousness raising, just basically raising the consciousness of men and women so that they understand more and more that women don't have to be housewives if they don't want to be. One of the great concepts that the feminists brought to the table was the concept of privilege. And Peggy McIntosh is a classic example of someone who's made arguments about this, and her book is White Privilege and Male Privilege. And of course this can be, the following quote is about race, but it could equally be applied to masculinity as well, to men. She says, whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral. They're the normal, right? They're the norm, they're the average, they're also the ideal. So that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work that will allow them to be more like us. And so when we have a classic sort of phenomena when men tend to debate feminism, where men seem to think that the solution is to get women to be more equal to men, that the solution is to further allow women to be just like men, as opposed to women to be more like women. And in fact, I think you could probably apply that criticism to the second wave feminists, and we'll get back to this point in a minute. But the second wave feminists seem to have this sense that what's unfair, i.e. the exploitation that's going on, is precisely what it's taking away from women, or what's at stake for women is their ability to be, equals in the workplace, that kind of thing. And what Peggy McIntosh is sort of suggesting, I think, here is that maybe this is a classic sort of, almost like a Stockholm syndrome, if you know what that is. Do you know the Stockholm syndrome is this thing that they say happens when you get kidnapped? If you get kidnapped, God, I hope you never do, but were you ever to be kidnapped, sometimes they say that the victim sort of ends up falling in love with the kidnappers, or at least sort of adopting the point of view of the kidnappers, internalizing their moral universe, and sort of looking at their own kidnapping as being sort of morally justified somehow. And they look at the kidnapper as the victim of society and whatnot. And so that's the Stockholm syndrome, and I think Peggy McIntosh is sort of hinting a little bit at that here vis-a-vis second wave feminism, but let's get back to the key point here about privilege. Recently a friend of mine who's white told me that he and his wife were buying a house one day, and later he learned that earlier that same day that he'd bought the house, a black couple had tried to buy it and had been turned down And he speculated that this was probably because of the owners' perceptions of what their ownership would do to property values in the area. And so, here's a classic example of privilege from Peggy McIntosh's point of view, because the reality is that, and my friend was speculating on this, he was very aware, he felt very ashamed in a way, because had he known this was going on, he would never have been part of it, right? But he couldn't help but be part of it in this instance, because he was unaware, but there's no way that he would have been able to buy the house had the black couple not been turned down. And that is a form of privilege, even if we are not thinking or imagining ourselves as racist, even in the slightest. And my friend is not racist at all, so far as he's aware or I'm aware. He's very anti-racist, but in the structure of the situation, there was a racism, and that's what Peggy McIntosh is getting at. That there's a kind of we are unwittingly sometimes the perpetrators of racism. And that raises the question, well, what do we do about it? Sometimes if we're unknowingly complicit in racism or in sexism, then what do we do about it? And I think that's the $10 million question here. For Freedom, the campaign is just to create knowledge, to try to further create structures that allow women to get ahead in the workplace. But it's not clear that that's going to do much about invisible forms of racism. So how can we change society to address that issue? That's a crucial question. One category of feminists, of course, none of this is in your textbook. This is sort of just building up to that. But I think Cynthia Weber in the textbook is providing some concepts and tools that sort of come out of this conversation. So to get to Cynthia Weber, we need to talk at least a little bit about the Marxist feminists and their critique of the second wave, kind of like Peggy McIntosh. They're asking, what does it really mean to be equal in a world where privilege, where advantage is sometimes so invisible, right? And one of the great commentators on this phenomena has been Bell Hooks, a great feminist. She's still doing public speeches. She's at OSU a couple of times a year. If you guys are ever interested, let me know, and I will be happy to keep you posted. She does come to Columbus from time to time to give talks at OSU, and she's always a great speaker, although she's getting older now. So, she was well known for the fact that she would not capitalize her name. So her name is Bell Hooks without a capital B and without a capital H. And she's doing that, I think, to sort of resist the sort of feeling that she has to behave herself a certain way. She's resisting the norm, and that's sort of in keeping with her entire political theoretical approach, I suppose. She says that second wave feminism has a problem insofar as what it was really arguing for, the sort of utopia that it was arguing for, the solution that it was arguing for, was really a solution that would only really fit the needs and interests of white middle class heterosexual women. It doesn't address the needs of black women, poor women, gay women, lesbian women. The classic quote which I offer you from her text is that since not all men are equals in white supremacist capitalist patriarchal class structures, which men do you want to be equal to? So in that quote you can see really the problem, can't you? Like the second wave feminists were really only talking about patriarchy. They didn't talk about capitalism, they didn't talk about white supremacism. There are all these other vectors of power. And so people can be, white women can get a huge advantage over black women and poor women, or both, because of their color of their skin. And so second wave feminism, because it didn't ask those questions, is found wanting by people like by Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks was inspired by Engels. You've heard of Karl Marx. Well, Marx's co-author was Friedrich Engels. Engels has claimed that the modern wife differs from a prostitute only in that she does not hire out her body like a wage worker on piecework, but sells it into slavery once and for all. So there is this question here from Engels' point of view as a Marxist, that there's other kinds of violences that go on that are to do kind of with capitalism as well as everything else. So from this point of view then, asking for equal rights for women appears to be a bit naive, because capitalist society isn't going to pay for all the things that Betty Friedan is demanding, right? Society benefits a lot from having women that provide cheap labor, and therefore the enemy is you have to start talking about capitalism as the enemy, not just patriarchy. So anyway, regardless of your feelings on that, the point is that not all women share the same issues or problems, and so from this Marxist perspective, the field gets opened up a little bit more. Another Marxist feminist, if I can use that term, I'm not sure she would agree with it, but I suspect she would be okay with it. Another Marxist feminist is Nancy Fraser, and like Hooks, Fraser worries that there might be a problem with feminists today, insofar as because feminism from the second wave perspective became all about in enabling women. From the feminist perspective, all these other sort of pluralities of feminism emerged, and what Nancy Fraser worries about is that we have sort of trendy feminism today, we have identity-based feminism today, we have an obsession with political correctness today, and it's all about, in a way, if I can use my own words here, it's all about sort of individualization of feminism. It's all about being kind of nice to each other, and kind of like Hooks, what Fraser is arguing is that, where's the actual material enablement for women? Where are the goods? Where are the goodies? Right? Why are we not coughing up money and resources to help women get ahead in the world, in a world that's quite honestly, historically, given men a huge material advantage over women? We've seen these facts at the start of the lecture. So if we're going to get stuck and focused on all these sort of LGBT issues, or we're going to get stuck and focused on housewife issues without putting money down, then we have a problem insofar as it appears that the women's movement has forgotten how to make demands based on solidarity, demands based on sort of togetherness, that all these different sort of feminisms have bifurcated out and become solitary soldiers, so to speak, without considering the need for a unified front. And I see a lot of Hooks' argument in here, the need for sort of thinking about going beyond the particularity of interests of, say, white women or gay women, now sort of trying to think about all of these groups together as together in their difference, right? Having something like a common platform that speaks to the needs of women as well. So that's an important question. Now, having sort of set those sort of historical terms out, let's start to turn our attention now to the kind of feminism and the tension in feminism that we need to discuss in order to be able to watch our movie. In order to be able to watch this movie, we need to address postmodern feminism. The classic sort of move of the liberal feminists that we've been talking about, Betty Friedan and the rest, is that they want to look at how women are oppressed by gendered power relations. And so for them, the power of patriarchy is sort of external. It's a power, as I always do this sort of hand gesture with myself, like it's a power that's up and over and above me, right? It's keeping me down. It's external to me. I might be brainwashed by it. I might agree with it through that process of being brainwashed or ideologized or whatever have you, but it's still a power that's somehow external to me. And I think one of the things I'd like to offer with you, my sort of take on feminism, postmodern feminism, which is the other feminism we're going to use here to contrast. And again, this is setting us up so that we can talk about Cynthia Weber's chapter, right? So postmodern feminism disagrees with this idea, right, that power is somehow up and over and above. It says instead that all of us, men and women alike, are human beings. And as such, our human experience is located inescapably within language, because what makes us human beings and not just animals is the fact that we talk to each other, right? That's what makes us a species that is capable of changing itself to sort of echo Marx's famous description of what it means to be human. We can change our species being. And of course, I think Aristotle said something very similar once upon a time. But human experience located within language. So what does that mean? It means that really, as a species, as a social phenomena, human beings have to deal with the fact that we're all, in a sense, victims of power. We're all, in a sense, victims of that language and the limitations that language puts on our minds in terms of our ability to imagine our worlds. And so, what that means is that a white female CEO of a major international corporation is going to be just as much a victim of power as a poor, black male who's stuck on a welfare system and cannot find a job. We all can be victims. Similarly, we all can be perpetrators of power. And when it comes to thinking about gender, the key move then within this sort of notion of power, which is a much more modest notion of power, if you will, right? Because it's suggesting there aren't these giant oppressive regimes that we need to smash to pieces, that it's not about revolution or rebellion in that sense, that really the work that we have to do is much more modest. It's much more everyday. It's much more about talking to each other. And so the cultural mechanisms then, that's what's really interesting. It's the everyday cultural mechanisms that postmodern feminists are interested in. And they argue that these cultural mechanisms encode the female body with meanings and explain these meanings by an appeal to the natural differences between the sexes, differences that rules themselves help to produce. And so what it is that's going on in these cultural mechanisms that encode the female body with meanings, basically they are if you will, almost like machines, right? These cultural mechanisms, these languages, these discourses are machines that encode the female body with expectations, right? That men and women share alike about what that body is supposed to be doing. And of course, those expectations are based on appeals to natural differences. So we've talked in the start of this class, way back at the start of the semester, we mentioned Aristotle and his argument that that women are broken men, that they're basically men missing a little bit. And what I think Aristotle, we're not necessarily blaming him for thousands of years of patriarchy, far from it. But what we can see in Aristotle is that someone who was writing about philosophy at his time, he was a child of his circumstances, he was a child of his society. And what we can see in Aristotle is not so much the creation of patriarchy, but the symptoms of patriarchy. Okay, and so in his work, in his philosophy, we see part of this cultural mechanism, right? That is encoding the female body with expectations of how it ought to behave. When Aristotle says that women have no place in politics because of their difference with men, this is exactly what Frug here is saying in the quote, that there's an appeal to the natural differences between the sexes. For Aristotle, women are irrational creatures, and because that they are sort of slaves to their passions, it's better to put them in a situation where those passions are helpful for them, right? i.e. in a domestic situation where you want passions, you want love, you want children to be raised in love and care. Whereas for politics, you don't really want that kind of thing. You want sometimes politics. You need hard-nosed attitudes, and men are much better at that, says Aristotle. So it's by showing the differences between the bodies that you can justify how you read the female body, what you think the female body to signify, and many people today even still read the female body as signifying domesticity, a sort of gosh, I'm lost for words. A sort of a warmth or a domesticity or a femininity that is nurturing, and sexualized, of course. So those are things that certainly we need to keep in mind as we start to think about how gender has been related to within international relations theory, because that's our background. This is our background story. One contemporary example of how text works is that is raunch culture. And I kind of like this example because I think it sort of powerfully speaks to some of the issues that Cynthia Weber is trying to allude to in her chapter. So I'm citing here a book which was popular a couple years ago called Female Chauvinist Pigs by Ariel Levy, Women and the Rise of Raunch Culture. And the feminist mystique was all about women trying to sort of disencumber themselves from this system of patriarchy that was giving them ideas about having to live domestic lives, and that if they could just throw back the shackles, if they would just to free themselves and emancipate themselves from this domination of patriarchy, they would rise and become lawyers and doctors and surgeons and all kinds of different things, and they would be equal to men in every single sense of the way, in every single sense of the term. But what Ariel Levy sort of wants to explore, and I think she's a bit of a postmodern feminist, right? Because she's very interested in how once women feel they're free, as many do today because of the struggles of their grandparents or their parents for their political liberation, that they may still be sort of subscribing to, even in their freedom, so to speak, views which are, unbeknownst to them, perhaps still quite debilitating or unrewarding for women. And so the classic example that Ariel Levy turns to is Female Chauvinist Pigs. For her book Female Chauvinist Pigs is the example of Girls Gone Wild videos. And Ariel Levy's question, I guess, for Girls Gone Wild is, well, what the hell's going on here? We have a situation where girls appear on these videos for free, and what are they doing, right? They are simulating stripper culture, or they are sort of going through the routines of making pretend they're strippers. Now, says Ariel Levy, well, you might think that's fine, but strippers get paid, and Girls Gone Wild girls don't get paid. So let's look at strippers and see what they're getting paid to do. They're getting paid to simulate a authentic and real sexual ecstasy for the entertainment of men, and sometimes women too, I suppose. But is that a problem? Ariel Levy, I think, would say partially it is. I mean, at least they're getting paid for it, but it's not really a rewarding or authentic sexual experience. What's really weird about the raunch culture and the Girls Gone Wild videos, and these girls that voluntarily appear in these videos, is that they are twice removed from it, right? So they're simulating a simulation of an authentic sexual act. And Ariel Levy wants to ask, so for who is this? Is it for the women? Do the girls feel enabled by it somehow? So she goes around after the people who make the documentary, the movies, and asks the girls afterwards, so what's motivating you to be in this video? And the girls say generally, our grandparents fought for our sexual liberation. We're sexually free now. We can do what we want with our bodies, and we're free. And this is it. This is emancipation. And so Ariel Levy, I think, smells a rat there. As we've said, it's a simulation of an authentic sexual act. And I wonder if she is somehow pointing the finger at second wave feminism and saying, well, you guys basically liberated women to be better participants in a world that's still based on male values, right? So you thought the goal was for women to get out of the kitchen, get out of the domestic situation, become doctors, lawyers, tra-la-la-la-la, and that was liberation. But you forgot, in a way, to think about the way women's bodies are sexualized, and how, in a way, that kind of the way we have women's bodies sexualized today is still kind of in a way that serves male fantasies, serves male needs. And so perhaps that system of patriarchy is still there in a way, right? But not operating as a regime of power that's somehow external to men and women, but rather it's part of our language, right? It's the subtleties and the nuances of the question, I think, that become apparent here, that where language is very intimate, where language is very personal, it's often hard to see the play, right? It's hard to see the play that's being made. And I think the fact that men and women are caught up in raunch culture, for men, the appreciation of it, for women, the participation in it, suggests something here that maybe patriarchy, not to say the second wave feminists are entirely unaware of this, but that postmodern feminism, I think, can zoom in a little bit on this a little bit more and show just how difficult it is once you identify language as the problem, just how difficult it is for women and men to liberate themselves of this kind of chauvinism, as the little piece here from the back of the book. If male chauvinist pigs of years past thought of women as pieces of meat, and that's the second wave feminism problem, right? Female chauvinist pigs of today are doing them one better, making sex objects of other women and of themselves. And so why would women voluntarily dominate themselves? Why would they self-dominate? I think second wave feminism has a harder time seeing that because it tends to externalize the power relation. It tends to think of patriarchy as something external to women, and women are sort of somehow fighting for liberation against patriarchy. But if women are also the creators and the self-perpetrators, if you will, of sexism, then postmodernism is, I think, more capable of seeing that. The postmodern approach then wants to look at the sort of textual and narrative processes that force people to live in ways that maybe are not in their self-interests. The second wave feminists were definitely into this, but look at some of the concepts that postmodernists offer to help us try to decode some of this a little bit better. One of the key things that the postmodern feminists tend to ask is about the processes that make us whole. From the perspective of postmodern feminism, and some of the authors they read, like Lacan, Derrida, there's a sort of an emptiness at the center of the human psyche that needs to be validated. And it's in a way you could say it's partially to do with the fact that we live modern lives now and we don't have religion to sort of give us meaning in our lives. Because we don't have religion, we are we don't really know what life is for, and that creates a kind of an emptiness in ourselves that we need to fill, or at least paper over. And so we use rules of difference to create hierarchies of superiority, to paper over that absence, to paper over that lack. So as in-groups, men who are powerful can create a hierarchy that says, just as Aristotle was trying to do, that says that men are superior to women, women should serve the interests of men, and that is ethical and proper and just because men are more deserving because of their superiority to women, right? The jobs that men have to do, political jobs, for example, are more pressing, more demanding than housework. So it is constantly the man that should be rewarded. The woman should make the dinner for the man when he comes in and have his newspaper and his slippers and his pipe ready for him, that kind of thing, you know? The question then about the role of difference is that it allows us to see that we're creatures with a lack, that we need to be reaffirmed, that difference is often used then to artificially create a sense of an affirmation of who I am, right? I use my difference with women to affirm my positivity as a male, right? So the problem, of course, is that if where you might say that's well and good, but then it does raise a question, and that is this one, that if all we are these processes of creating difference, then how do we have any control of it? How can we ever hope to change anything if all we are is script? Is there any way we can ever be free of this script, right? So there's a kind of a fatalism in postmodernism that upsets a lot of people. And so the question is, what are the bases of optimism for improving the world if we just take a postmodern standpoint that say everything is just text, everything is just these rules of difference? Well, one classic line and one scholar that's really done a lot of work on this is Judith Butler. And she has this wonderful quote, which I wanted to offer to you, wherein she says, "There is no original or primary gender a drag imitates, but gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original." So a drag queen, in other words, right? So she's asking this question, okay, if everything is text, and if there's no way to know what's real because we're all basically hopeless victims of history and language, what choices do we have? Well, she's saying on the margins that we do have choices, and we can sort of play games with the scripts. We can try to expose some of the contradictions and the power plays that are going on, and we can do that by adopting a kind of a drag queen posture. Not that you or I literally need to become drag queens or anything, but look at what the drag queen does in the abstract. The drag queen is obviously a man imitating a woman, right? But imitating what, right? In a way, what the drag queen is kind of doing is imitating something that is itself an imitation, that is itself just text. So by imitating an imitation, by exposing a gender role as just a gender role and not a real role, the drag queen challenges our expectations of what is acceptable behavior. And I think in America, where society has such commonly has got this common tendency to engage in gendered thinking and gendered textuality, this kind of thing can be really helpful. So drag queens can intervene in the script and show that even though life is textual and politics is textual, there are options. So in this slide, we are asking the question about now that we've talked about postmodern feminism, we're in a position to start thinking about some of the issues that are discussed by Cynthia Weber in the chapter that we are assigned for reading this week, and ask why all this stuff that we're talking about might matter for international relations. And my hope is that by this stage, what I've given you is an understanding of what's at stake in drawing a difference between conceiving power as somehow operating externally and over us, that women might be sort of dominated by that external power that's operating over them, are saying that sort of men and women alike are victims of something much more subtle, which is a gendered text or a gendered history, if you want to call it that sort of itself has a power, but it's not a power over us, it's a power among us, because in a sense we are both the victims and the perpetrators equally. And I like the Girls Gone Wild example because I think it reveals that. I think it reveals men and women as both engaging in the reproduction of the text, which makes Girls Gone Wild possible, and showing how men and women equally are the victims of this text. Now, if that's our parable, if you will, we take that into international relations and we start to ask the question, is it possible to sort of fix international relations so it better reflects the particular concerns and interests of women? Or is it possible that we look at international relations itself as a text, or the textuality of international relations, and try to read that as a gendered phenomenon in itself? Again, to sort of go back to our old question, are we trying to add women and stir to make international relations a better tasting soup? Or are we saying the soup itself is tasteless, bland, or even poisoned when it comes to thinking about gender? Okay, and that we should just throw it out and maybe start again. So in a way, this question goes back to, as we said earlier on, the first question we asked this semester, which is, can we have a science of IR? Many feminists reject the idea of putting femininity in a box, right? Simply adding gender as a variable in the classic picture of man, the state, and war. They say gender hides a lot of power relations. Cynthia Enlow's book, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, is a great source here if ever you guys are interested in looking in more detail at this. people like Cynthia Enloe want to ask the question about state security, for example. Henry Kissinger and the other realists that we've thought about, they all argue that security for the state is tanks and guns and bombs, and we can measure security of the state in that way, and it's quantifiable in a scientific sense. Feminists ask, well, what about the things that all that military spending does in terms of women's suffering, right? There are other things we could be spending that money on, and are those things not in their own way part of national security? Think, for example, about the plight of a woman living in sub-Saharan Africa, or Darfur, for example, where the people of Darfur were subjugated and set upon by state-sponsored militias coming down from the north in an act of genocide. The nation state thought of its military equipment as national security, but for the women in Darfur, in Sudan, that was insecurity in the highest sense of the term, right? It was literally a genocidal machine coming down upon them. So we do have to sort of think that perhaps a little differently about national security if we're going to think about it from a gendered perspective, because the game of international relations that everyone thinks is the normal game in the Darfur context appears to be quite loaded. We also think about the women who protested in Greenham Common in the height of the second part of the Cold War in Britain, and formed a human chain because they wanted to draw attention to the counterproductiveness of spending all this money on nuclear weapons when we had already more than enough to destroy the world the whole time, several times over. Why would we spend more money on nuclear weapons than we needed? Surely this was, in a way, an erosion of security. It was destruction of the potential of human life. And that's what women wanted to draw attention to there. Right? So state security, just as Girls Gone Wild, national security is grounded in appeals to codes of masculinity. These nuclear weapons are seen to be manly. These guns and these bombs are all sort of structured in our society. If we look at our popular culture, it's always Arnold Schwarzenegger types or Sylvester Stallone types that are wielding them, and they are seen to be the icons or the symbols of virtue. But in no uncertain terms, the question that the feminists are bringing to bear here, the postmodern feminists, is just how coded and unhelpful these expectations are, these movies are, in terms of the expectations that they give us about how the world ought to operate. You could think also, for example, of the British conquest of India and how their notion of masculinity there was very prevalent. In terms of the fact that, for example, the geographers who went in with the armies to map India explicitly saw their mapping in using very gendered language. They thought that they were geographers who were going into they thought of the Indian countryside as a feminine territory, as jungle, as sort of untamed land. And their job as geographers was to render it measurable, to map it all out, and to tame this wild female sort of presence and energy of India. If you look at their diaries and their texts, their writings around the time, you see a lot of this sort of idea of, the British male penetration into the Indian jungle and all this kind of stuff. And it's all very, very coded and in a way obvious. Interestingly, we asked the question though again, did the geographers know that they were sexist? Probably not. By our standards, they clearly are. But the stigmas were hidden in their own language, and they were in a way, sadly, they were the perpetrators, but they were also in a sense the victims of their culture. And I think that's something that postmodern feminism is sensitive to. So this is just some stuff that takes us back to the start of the quarter, or the start of the semester. We were talking about myths. We were talking about what is natural and what is deviant, and how subconscious ideologies are set up. You can go back and think about some of your notes from that lecture again here if you want to. We talked about Stephen Colbert and truthification, and how singular assumptions become generalized truths through processes of truthification. We use this term jokingly, of course, but the process is a very real one. That the more people who have power, legitimate positions, for example, priests, scientists, receptive audiences, short but sweet, sort of pithy phrases, the more of these variables we have that we can identify, the more we start to understand how truths become generalized. And so we have examples here of myths like Englishmen are all white. If I ask you to close your eyes and think of an Englishman, what does the person look like? A lot of people will say a guy in a pinstripe suit and a bowler hat, and he's white and drinking tea. And boys will be boys. What does that mean? It means boys are truculent, poorly behaved, and that this is kind of an excuse for them. Girls are made of sugar and spice, and all things nice. There's an old myth there, all right, that women are kind, nurturing, gentle, mild, meek, and of course, therefore, girls that do not live to that expectation are sort of seen as unusual, right? They're seen as renegades or tomboys, and immediately we have a sort of a separation of expectations there, But there's power in that, right? The question is, who is wielding the power? And in our arguments here, we have clearly a sort of a complexity in thinking about exactly who has the power. This is the slide. I guess I sort of gave you the background in this slide already in talking about Darfur and talking about Henry Kissinger. But just again, how do we define security here? What counts as security for Henry Kissinger in terms of nuclear weapons, tanks, jet fighters, is insecurity for the woman in the picture, right? Because her experience living in Darfur has showed her that all of these things, tanks, planes, their revenue that the state is spending on things that are not helpful to her because she's starving, number one. B, they can be used against her by reactionary forces within the state that the state's willing to sponsor. So that's another sense in which, it's not helpful for her. So security is, whether it likes it or not, it draws on codes of masculinity. And so now we know, I guess, that that gender matters in a nuanced way, in a subtle way that perhaps we weren't able to see beforehand. And so now we're in a position where we can start to think about the movie we want to watch, and we can start to think about the supplemental writing that we have for this week, which comes from Adam Jones. Jones suggests, and I think he's probably correct in some ways here, but he describes feminism in his text as sort of constituted of four major points. One, he focuses on women as historical and political actors. Two, women, feminism, gender studies has this idea that there's an epistemological foundation in the realm of women's experience. That is to say, there's a standpoint. When we say epistemology, of course, we mean what gives you a sense that what you're saying is true. By what basis are you saying something is true? If you live in a highly religious country among religious people, people can say, well, because it's God says so, right? It's in the Bible. That's your epistemological basis for saying something is true. God said so, or a priest said so. Your license for saying something is true in a more scientific society would have to be based on science, right? Your license for saying something is true about women's experience comes from the standpoint that you're basically saying, I'm a partisan for women. I'm not trying to be neutral here. I'm trying to make a partisan comment, and I'm being honest with you about it. I want to fight for women's rights. I want women to have an advantage that they don't currently have. So when we say epistemological foundation, it means that there's a sort of from Jones's point of view at least anyway, that feminism is not scientific because it is taking a side, and that's how I would interpret point two. Point three, women and the feminine constitute underprivileged standpoints. So the idea that women's standpoints, their epistemological foundation, to use that language again, is not currently entitled to the same standing that other feminisms or other perspectives are entitled to within society. Women's viewpoints are underprivileged and have been, of course, since the time of Aristotle, if not long before that. And it's taken hundreds and thousands of years, in fact, to start to unravel that and to give the feminine standpoint a greater role in society, a greater voice in society. Fourth, then, for Jones, all feminism is unified by the fact that men are seen as constituting an international class. That is something that Cynthia Weber, I guess, would dispute to an extent, but I'm going to actually end the lecture here, because the rest of it is something we have to do in class, because we start to think about the movie a bit more, and we have to watch the movie before we can really take it any further, because that's what's going to give us the basis for evaluating Adam Jones's argument. So, okay, I hope this was helpful, guys, and we will talk again very soon. See you next week.